I'm back with another episode of Semi-Pro. This time I've brought along YouM3. He's a commentator, an analyst, a statistician, a regular, bona fide broadcast jack of all trades. Notably appeared at Flashpoint 2 and a few Dreamhack events last year. He joins me to talk about his role as a commentator, his thoughts on content production in general, and of course, rising up through the ranks to become listed on those A-tier events and S-tier events on Liquipedia. So I actually wanted to start with your latest work at Flashpoint 2. You were initially touted as the stats guy when I saw those opening broadcasts and they did all those predictions and they were talking about those pinnacle points. One of the things that they kept citing was that, oh, YouM3, our stats guy, he's crunching the numbers, he predicts this, and they use that as a bit of a talking point on the broadcasts to fuel their own predictions. Can you shed some light on what you did behind the scenes? Because I didn't ever, maybe I missed it, maybe it was covered in one of the blind spot segments or something, but I never personally figured out what they were alluding to when they said that you were the stats guy, the number cruncher.
Sure. Well, it was my first time ever doing stats at an event. And that being offered that position then was kind of daunting to me. So I naturally reflected and actually asked a few other people that have done the role before. So look at sort of SEO. I think AZS does it as well. I think he's done it for some DreamHack events. And just wondered kind of their approach to it, because I had just sort of ran through HLTV, some clutch statistics, some maybe even sort of flash utilization, just depending on how the teams were structured. And so I think they initially pitched it to me in an idea that was very reminiscent of sort of like baseball stats when they come up, and they'll have amount of home runs, amount of hittings, amount of times they strike out, that type of thing. And they wanted to have something that could be pushed into a narrative in a sense.
Yes.
So when I came on board, I created like a large document with a load of those numbers. Those were available for the talent. Some of it actually because it was a very sort of last minute filling. Some of it was actually incomplete, but there were teams that I would fill in later, so it ended up rounding out fine. But primarily it was just being a resource that the talent could then, or I would even ask the talent, is there any sort of narrative or an idea that you want to push in one particular direction or another, and are there any numbers that I can pull to try and reinforce that? Some of them were just cute little stats, like I think I'm trying to remember, it was I think NBK versus, oh god, I can't remember now off the top of my head, but it was just like an old stat of like the first time they ever faced off against each other on train, and It was like thousands and thousands of days ago, and that was something cute that the commentators brought up on broadcast that was kind of interesting. So it wasn't something that was as in depth as maybe I would have particularly liked, because I think if you want to go super in depth in stats, you need to have your own custom demo parsers and tools of that nature, which we just didn't have the infrastructure for. So it was very much sort of pulling data from HLTV and just looking through past games to try and find something that people could talk about.
Since you referenced commentators themselves bringing it up in the middle of games as a bit of a fun point, were there any things that you were able to provide that you sort of reflected on and thought, man, if I were casting this game, I would really want to know this stat? Or was there anything where maybe, like you said, you came to the commentators or the broadcast talent and said, is there anything specifically that I can hunt for? Did you have any ideas yourself as to what might make a better broadcast out of just having the stat on hand? Was there any particular things that you can remember?
I think almost the inverse in a way, which was very sort of existential crisis for me at the event, because when I was looking at some of the stats, I was like, oh yeah, I could bring this up. I could tell this to the commentators. But then as a commentator myself, I know that can be sometimes distracting, or it might not push the same idea that is sort of referenced in the commentary so much. And it would almost be jarring to go from, oh, this player's been doing really, really well. By the way, this guy has 4 1vx's in the past week, you know? Like, I'd never felt as though it fit into the flow of commentary as seamlessly as I would have liked. And part of that, I think, has to do with just how sort of dynamic the game progresses, and how quickly a stat can just be clicked off just like that. Like, I had a stat that I was tracking where the amount of games where a player had not had a negative event or not had a negative match, and then I'd have some of those stats ready for the game, and they could bring it up, and it was just like, oh, and they've had that like a day ago, or because there were multiple events going on at the same time for Flashpoint, it would happen in IEM Beijing, and it's just, oh, okay, it happened in the other event, so it's not really worth talking about here at Flashpoint anymore. So I don't think anything particularly stood out. There were some moments where I thought, oh yeah, this particular sort of damage number or 1vx factor is pushes the same narrative because this player is just kind of owning in the server at the moment. But it more often than not, I'd hunt a statistic, I'd find one, and I'd just be like, it doesn't really fit into the flow of commentary anymore.
Right, exactly. And that's one of those things too that it must be a little frustrating when maybe you don't have as much say as a commentator as to what stats gets shown on screen at the same time, and you have to find some sort of awkward way to sort of crowbar in whatever you were saying into fit whatever the stat is saying on screen that all of the viewers might be looking at that moment. So that can definitely be a challenge to try to overcome. And that's one of those things too that speaks to, you know, the importance of having that collaboration and having communication between the broadcast and who's like putting everything on, but also the talent and the commentators that are speaking there. So my next question for you in this sort of line of logic there is, were there points where you were putting together stats where maybe you had some idea not only about which stats could be deployed, but also the manner in which they are presented to the commentators? Like I've seen it as an example. Somebody suggested, I can't remember where, but that maybe if you have like an array of stats all there, the commentators could just pick which one goes onto the feed that they can then reference there. I mean, that also speaks to maybe overhead. So maybe that specific idea might not be the best idea, but just curious as to if you have had any ideas for how to actually alter the way that these are presented or alter the way that the commentators themselves can interact with them. Was there anything that came up as a result of you working at Flashpoint 2 that was along these lines?
So I created sort of like a shortlist document of some interesting statistics going into the event, sort of day one. So I think the ones that I most touted were sort of Yakindar entry statistics and Searson and James sort of scoped rifle versus real rifles or other real weapons effectively, and how they sort of overuse those weapons versus everything else. So you see Searson very often picking up a scout instead of an AK at times when it makes sense to. And so having stuff like that where you could just reference them at any time, they were there, but it was very, again, because some statistics were so frail, where if it was a streak or if it was a flurry of or a stat that's tracking multiple games in their history, sometimes they just dip off, and so that's not available. So I sort of toyed with formats, and one of the ways that we just kind of collaborated with each other was I'd maybe just put something into a little talent WhatsApp group, and if they wanted to reference it on broadcast, they could, or if the analyst wanted to bring it up after the fact, that's fine. So long as it was having some level of impact, I was sort of satisfied to do that. I think it's important to note as well that when it came to actually implementing the stats on the broadcast, the first few days were a bit of a difficulty because it's a role that Faceit and just the Flashpoint and Faceit broadcasts haven't had before. So figuring out a correct workflow to implement it without it being too jarring was also one of the sort of fighting forces against the role as we went in.
Of course, yeah. So actually, I wanted to talk now, if we segue into when you actually appeared on the broadcast, casting next to Anders, no less. At that point, you were the one who had to be the one to sort of be the vehicle for speaking these stats into existence should they come up. Was that a case where the stats were still there? Like, had you prepared ahead of time, like which stats you wanted to track? Did somebody else come in and fill your shoes as the stats guru when you were in the middle of casting? What was that like?
Yeah, not so much. I think I was probably just more nervous about actually casting with Anders and casting a game in which not many people will know this, but one of the first big commentators I ever casted with was actually Henry G. So casting his team now in a group stage game where they're not doing too hot was also kind of a weird experience. But nobody sort of filled in my role and then was also offloading stats. I didn't feel as though I was having the most amount of impact with the commentators in terms of funneling them information, because not only are they doing their own prep work, I'm trying to find additional statistics that they're not going to consider for the broadcast, because especially for someone like Hawker who loves to bring those up on his casts, he will always do a bit of homework or a bit of narrative twining. So finding something that he didn't pick up on, or even just referencing something in the game at the moment was probably more important to me. But when it came to my own casting, I think I was just more focused on trying to deliver myself, because I'm not so used to pulling the statistics for myself to bring up on broadcast all too often as well, especially without me sort of being at my own PC where I have another monitor here where I can have a notepad and just a bunch of narrative points if I want to pull from them.
So in that vein, when you decided to sit down, or I'm not really sure exactly how that was decided, so maybe you can also go into detail with this when you answered this question, but I was curious as to how that dynamic ended up shaping up. After sort of reflecting back on it, how did you feel the casting in general went at Flashpoint 2? Like, obviously it's an opportunity to cast with Anders, who's legendary in the space. So once you get past that sort of awestruck moment, perhaps, where you're like, oh, okay, now it's the big leagues, you know, you're sitting there, you eventually get into it. One of the things I've noticed is that no matter how nervous you might be with a specific partnership or something like that, in my own experience, interviewing some people who are much bigger than I am and maybe bigger than I ever will be, the question then becomes like, okay, once you get into it, you can kind of relax, you can kind of zone in and be focused. And that's sort of how things go. So maybe that opening period can be awkward, but as long as we get in and as long as we start feeling out like this is something I'm familiar with, it's like looking at all the games and casting the plays themselves, or you know, recapping how the plays went over. So how did you feel in general that casting partnership went when you were duoing with him?
So in terms of just overall dynamic, the first thing I always ask when I do it with somebody new is, one, how do you want to do this? Do you want to do strict play-by-play versus color? Because I know some people that I've worked with in the past are very stringent. They want a specific time frame in a round where it's their time, and I'm fine with that. I'm fine to fill wherever. But for both Anders and Semler, which I casted with afterwards, both of them, they're just there to have a good time. They've been doing it for such a long time that they just fill wherever. So it was very much, I could have my own space. If I didn't feel like I could add anything, take a step back, they go, and we just have a little conversation back and forth that way. So it wasn't as sort of daunting as it may look. Like, oh, I have to now kind of step up to the plate. I'm filling for Semler in a sense. But I could just cast how I normally do, and it was I think it was fine. I think overall the casting reception from what I've seen was very positive. Obviously some people have their criticisms, and that's always going to be the case. But I don't think anything went catastrophically wrong, which I think is as good as I can hope for, basically. Just make sure that everybody's happy. I think the casting pairs were fine. And I think, especially with Anders, I felt like I worked off his energy just a whole lot, just because he's such a... He has that sort of aura to him where he's just so excited for Counter-Strike, and it rubs off on you.
Of course, yeah. That's also something to note, too, is that you've spent so much time, if you're just any Counter-Strike viewer, you've spent so much time listening to Anders talk about Counter-Strike and feeling his energy, and because you've watched so many games that he's casted. So I was curious as well if there was anything that was different when you decided, you know, when it was decided that you were going to sit down next to him for the casting, or, you know, any of the other people that you casted with in general. Is there a point where, like, you've seen them, you've tracked the way that you think that they operate on the broadcast, when you watch them cast with somebody else, and then you come and sit down? Does that equip you for anything, or is it a totally different ball game when you're actually there next to them?
Well, I found it interesting with Anders is because his previous partner Moses, where he had kind of struggled with energy on the broadcast so much. I'm one of those people as well. I always feel as though I'm actually pretty excited, but the way my voice inflects doesn't always bring across that. And in a way, I felt very similar to Moses in that sense, because I felt I almost had to, like, elevate myself a little bit more, be a little bit more excited, but then I'd have this bit in the back of my mind where I'm saying, like, it is a group stage game, don't overdo it. Like, it's not a final, it's not a big deal. This is just, we're trying to get a gauge of how all these teams play, because a lot of the teams coming into Flashpoint actually had roster moves or something to prove, or if they were new. So there wasn't as many talking points. It was just sort of bringing the action and seeing how that might impact the sort of future runnings for them at Flashpoint. So I don't think there was anything. Yeah, I don't think there was anything that stood out too much. But working with Anders, I understood that I could just be my own person, which is fine.
One of the other things that you referenced earlier is that some casters really do prefer to have like maybe set regimented sections where, okay, you color now and I'll play by play then. And like at 30 seconds into the round or whatever the case may be, right? And everybody's got their own sort of, they're still feeling out their own methodology or their own conception of what that might look like, of course. And the more you get into it, the more rigid maybe you start to become in your ways. So I'm curious as to what the Yumi method of Counter-Strike casting looks like. Like, do you have your own personal conception of what works best for you, or what you think is best to listen back to? Is this something that you've thought about in great detail as far as like balancing color and play-by-play and reacting to how dynamic Counter-Strike itself can be?
I think in 2020, most of my focus was actually set on creating or allowing or propping up my co-commentator in a way that allows them to do the play-by-play. But my main focus was not only setup, but trying to comfortably add in ad-libs. I'm quite a silent guy when it comes to... I like to give other people the space to talk. If I feel a little bit of a space, I'll try and chime in there. But some of the most hype moments in CS have been where people are screaming their lungs off in the backdrop while somebody's still full casting. And it's something that I'm trying to combat myself because it's outside of my own comfort zone. So that's something I've been attacking primarily. But I think that's sort of a role where I can prop up a situation where maybe it's a 2 versus 3 and the people in that are at a numbers disadvantage actually have an advantage. If I can point something out like that out, then the outcome of the round is sort of falling into my hands, and that sort of power complex I kind of enjoy. But when it doesn't happen, the welcome surprise is always nice as well. So it's a win-win in my book, and it allows the co-commentator to take most of the play-by-play, which is usually where I try and fill the other open space, or just have a conversation during the mid-round.
That's another thing to point out as well, is that you have to kind of keep your eye on things that maybe the play-by-play themselves can't do, because the play-by-play is busy on what's happening on screen, what might be happening next, trying to see the setup. If the X-ray is on, they're able to like maybe peer into the future a little bit and imagine what might be there. At the same time, maybe they're not full focused on the minimap or on maybe another angle of the match where you might be able to step in and say, well, keep your eye on this guy, or here comes the flank, or something like that. That a small like 5-word sentence that might be able to set the play-by-play up to not be caught off guard when something that would otherwise be very surprising does happen, and then they can keep the energy, keep the hype going. So has it been difficult depending on, or have there been cases where like it's been hard to find that avenue to really open up, or have there been cases where again you're sort of like encouraged not to because the play-by-play just wants their space? Like, how has that been in general for your casting, since that was such a focus of the past year?
Yeah, one of the worries was always if I spoke too loudly, they would almost think that I was trying to take over the play-by-play at times, which is, I think, especially in the early stages, what I would always do is I'd just be like, oh, there's one on the flank, or oh, there's a kit dropped. And it doesn't actually show up on the broadcast that well because the volume of AKs going off, the bomb being planted, whatever, that will drown out my little whisper in the wind. And while my co-commentator might hear it, that is then like, oh yeah, the defuse kit is on the ground. That's right. And they'll reference something that the audience can't hear. That's my biggest fear, is always overshadowing the play-by-play. When I want them to take the space, I'll just say a little ad-lib or a little addition to what's happening on screen, and them stepping back. That's a worry, because especially online, we can't visually look at each other and just say like, this is you, just keep going with it. It has to be this awkward back and forth where there's a bit of delay and just the round's gone. Cool. So yeah, there have been some bumps in the road. I know that when I've sort of taken over some play-by-play moments, we've had conversations after the fact where maybe I felt I should have been given more room, or there should have been maybe less ad-lib work from my co-commentator. And that's just something that always happens sort of naturally, right? That's something that you iron out over time, because none of us are, as bad as this is to say, everybody that gets started in commentary always works solo. That's the where you can draw the most amount of progress from, is just casting solo. But then when you get into duo work, it's almost a different ball game, and so you actually need to give room and find some way to contribute while the other person is casting. It is difficult. It's a weird balance to try and hit, and that's that's why I think I've sort of moved into this flexor. You said jack of all trades. I don't know if I'm really that, but I try and just fill in. I try to be like water, and if the ball has a few bumps in it, maybe I'll try and fill in the crevices.
One of the things that just starting off solo as a commentator will indeed prepare you for is having to cover all bases, and sort of like what you're alluding to, right? Is the idea of you have to be able to give the color, you have to be able to hype up the plays, and maybe it doesn't flow exactly like a play-by-play might, but then you're a solo caster, so there's different expectations there altogether. And I actually wanted to ask you a bit of this might be going super in the weeds for some people who maybe aren't as thoughtful about the mechanics of casting, but I did want to ask you about the era of the play-by-play that doesn't know anything about the game, right? And obviously that's a bit of a reductionist take anyway, but if you think about like Satikist, you think about some of like the really hype play-by-play guys, I think even now, if you look at the top play-by-plays, they all play the game and they're all relatively, skilled at least the mechanics of the game itself. They all understand at least something about the title. And not to say that Satikist himself didn't, but it was very clear when you looked at what he was prioritizing was more about the flow, and what he was able to achieve was more about like the showmanship aspect of casting, and maybe less about map knowledge, maybe less about game knowledge, because he didn't necessarily need to rely on that. That was something that obviously Henry G brought out. That was something that some of his casting duo partners brought out. So one of my questions to you at this point is, do we think that the era of the play-by-play that doesn't need to focus at all, or doesn't need to think about that much the game itself, and especially the pro meta as it's coming undone, do we think that that's sort of by the wayside? Is that gone now? Do we need play-by-plays who know enough about the game to be able to predict what's going to happen next? What's your take on this sort of, again, very, very like in the weeds question about casting mechanics?
Yeah, I think if you're a play-by-play and you don't understand sort of what is important and what is not, then you need to take a bit more time, I think. It's one thing to be excited about a 3K. It's another when it's on an eco. You don't.
Sure.
Especially when you're first starting out, you can just be like, oh my god, what an ace! But it's an eco ace. Like, he's got an SMG, he's running around with a Mac 10, whatever. It doesn't. You can still be kind of excited for him and be like, oh, he's farmed up so much money, that's fine. But you don't have to harp on it as a big factor or a big talking point within the round. So I think that era is dead. I don't think there's really any place for commentators like that, unless you've got a really, really strong color commentator that, or you're sort of attacking it from a different angle where you're not just catering to the veterans that watch CSGO in their downtime and they want to hear the in-depth strats. If you're breaking it down, sort of, if you know anything about sort of Dota casting, how sort of Purge had this sort of identity as being this newbie teacher, if you were going that route, then it works perfectly, because you can have this explanation almost of why this wasn't as important as it may have looked on paper versus another round where similar kills happened.
One of the things that I'm...
I sort of answered with a non-answer, effectively, where it's like, yeah, I don't think it can survive, but also it may have a place if you attack in the right angle.
Well, it's an interesting thing, too, the idea of a noob teacher anyway, because Counter-Strike is such a hardcore game relative to all of the other popular esports out there. And even those games that are more popular, but they're not as hardcore, right? They are a little bit more noob friendly. Like, I remember there were some worlds in League of Legends where these world championship tournaments actually had like a whole newcomer stream that you could tune into if you'd never seen the game before and you wanted to learn. And they were very much like low level noob friendly. Like, here's some education in that sense. And I'm not sure how successful those were at like encouraging people to try out the game, but on paper, it sounds like a great idea. It's just that in a world where we see tournament organizers looking to trim all of the fat possible so that they can squeeze through as many cracks as possible, right? That's a case where I don't see that happening unless we were to get a little bit more, maybe at like a major in a couple of years or something like that, we might see a dedicated like noob friendly cast. But I did want to ask about some of your opinions on broadcast desks as well, the analysis desks, because I feel like this is an area where people in general undervalue them. I mean, a lot of people will say like after the game's gone, like the viewership drops like 20K, tanks, something like that. So depending on where you come from, this is either not really that big of a deal, or it's like, well, what do we do with this space, right? Like if the viewership is dropping this much, then that means like lower engagement. And on the numbers game of things, the TOs have a right to be sort of worried about that. So my question to you then is sort of along the lines of like improving the analysis desks themselves and maybe what you think that some of the different TOs in 2020 did that you thought was good, or maybe that you thought might have been a step back, or maybe it was a failed experiment. So obviously we could start with Flashpoint 2. And obviously, I think this is actually an area where the stats that you were pulling might have had even more value, because the people who are on the desk don't have to balance the game and everything that's happening in the game with also like figuring out what stats to pull, because maybe they have the stats in that WhatsApp group or written down or something that they can decide to pull if it makes sense for the desk or for the blind spot, or, in the conversation that might be happening. So how did you feel Flashpoint 2 sort of differentiated itself with its analysis desks, and how much of that do you think was due to your input in general?
I'm not so much. I think I'm biased in a sense, because I think the way in which it separated itself was by having the telestrator segments, and I was a part of quite a few of those. Especially at the start of it, it was sort of a trial period for me to not only get used to running the telestrator, but also open it up to the other analysts to get involved in that and figure out a workflow that was efficient. I think that's not a new thing, right? That's harkening back to older times. That's years ago, but it was sort of scrapped as a project. And I think at ESL are doing some Skybox stuff, sometimes in sort of timeouts. I think Sponge forefronts most of that.
Yes.
And that I think by and large adds a lot to the analysis, because it does add this sort of more visual aspect where if you are maybe a lower level viewer, or you weren't paying as much attention as somebody that's dedicated to looking at a specific moment then you can have that explained to you, and you can maybe remember that strategy or what was happening in a round a bit more efficiently. When it came to the stats, unfortunately, because I don't, this being my first stats role, I don't have the ability to pull all of the statistics from a game live without them or before the analysis desk actually went on broadcast. So quite often I'd pull stats, they'd be available, but it'll be after the analysis segment, because they're not going to look at their phones or whatever. I could always feed that to the producer, that could feed it into their ear, but I think we tried that once and it was very, very distracting because they weren't hearing what the other analysts were saying.
Of course, yeah.
And so it's a difficult balance to strike, because they're able to look at the same sort of documents that I'm able to look at, but I'm just not able to. I wasn't quite able to get that workflow ironed out fast enough that I could always impact the analyst desk. Sometimes with extended breaks, or maybe they'd have they ran these great documentaries during Flashpoint, so sometimes those would be on broadcast, and then that way I could shovel off whatever notes that I might have for the game. But outside of moments like that where there wasn't as much shoulder content, then it didn't always feel like I had that direction of narrative that maybe I think the stats role should have.
Yeah, going into the future, what is your sort of conception of where the stats role might actually be able to impact the desks? Because now you're talking about maybe there's a hole here where there wasn't an opportunity to feed the stats most cleanly to the analysts in the middle of the segment. But maybe if they all got their laptops up and they occasionally glance down at a spreadsheet that gets updated or something, like there are ways technologically that we can solve that problem in theory. So given, an imaginary scenario where we have solved the issue of giving the information to the analysts in the middle of the broadcast, what do you think that might open up? What opportunities do you think might change for, engaging viewers and providing more like hard-hitting analysis in maybe in a more entertaining way even? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if you're able to get that workflow figured out fast enough, and you can actually pull those statistics on screen while they're referencing it, that's a lot more engaging. Looking at an analyst desk where it is just three people talking, and sure, the camera angles are changing, but that to a lot of people isn't as engaging. If you can look at the numbers, if you can look at the highlight reels with the numbers as well, it can help reinforce an idea in a viewer's head that this was a sick moment, or this guy had a great map, or this guy's doing a fantastic job for the team in a role that may be sort of underappreciated. Stats, I think, actually can make supportive players look a lot better, but we don't often have those stats available, because I love HLTV, but I hate it to death because there are so many restrictions, and I am so surprised there is not just some sort of API that you can pull for organizers to have a look at. It was so frustrating looking through individual statistics for every single player for categories I wasn't always the most interested in, but if I found something that was like a large discrepancy, say someone only had like a 7% headshot ratio or something, not that was anybody at Flashpoint, but if that ever came up, I'd be interested, and that could be something that could be reflected in the broadcast. But unless I look through all of these stringent statistics, I'm never going to find that one odd man out or this one interesting tidbit. And I think HLTV could be doing a lot better job. But I think it can be a lot more directive. And I really hope that there are sort of better produced ways to reinforce points on a desk without it just being conversational or eye test experiments effectively.
One of the things that you referenced earlier as well when you were talking about ways that you were able to finally sneak in some things is when the shoulder content showed up and they had those documentaries, the player profiles, or they had the skits or something like that that would fill some time, but also educate the viewers who might have missed them on the YouTube channel to, see a different side of the players or see a different side of the talent, even depending on what was actually being shown on screen. I was curious as to what input you might have had on some of that shoulder content for Flashpoint 2. Were there any skits that they had you in, or any ideas that you were able to? Essentially, was the access point there? If you had an idea to provide it to maybe Tom Diablo Newman or one of the other people who was involved.
I mean, I had a channel, but I think more focused on trying to validate my own existence there, more so than I think for branding purposes, it would have been great for me if I was on like one of those shoulder pieces. You have this the evil or mean Potter sort of segments. That was a fantastic sort of push in a direction that everybody, I think, kind of appreciated at the time. And even things like Sexy Maui. Those are weird but good branding opportunities for them. But I didn't really set my focus in that direction. I wasn't really an access point for that. I was given the floor to sort of pitch ideas if I wanted to, but I didn't really feel it was my place to sort of interject myself and be like, yes, let's make a skit about the stats guy. It's like, okay, people don't even... I'm a realist. Most people didn't really know who I was before the event anyway, so then injecting myself into a skit might have felt a little bit forced, in my opinion.
Well, one of the things that I think has been a real trend lately in general, if you look to Blast and you look to Flashpoint at least, there has been that push for now the doors are opening, the channels are there, as you said, for broadcast talent to make a push or to provide some sort of ideas, or maybe they can actually make some of the content pieces that they've always dreamed of into reality in the modern era. So do you think that this is going to continue? And like, what are your thoughts in general if we think about the content that is now being created by some of these TOs where they're leveraging the broadcast talent for the purpose of making this content? Or in Flashpoint's case, they obviously made those player profiles that are very evocative of like the old Major vibes when Valve did them. So do you have any ideas in general as to like, do you think this trend is going to continue? Do you think more content is going to be put out that's essentially from the brand or from the mind of some of the broadcast talent themselves?
Well, I know even from the MOBA genre, like Dota and League do a lot of shoulder content, and actually they make music videos and all sorts to try and reinforce the talent, which in my opinion is crazy. First off, you're a caster, then you're an analyst, now you're a glorified actor or like musician. Like you're really pushing a line where, okay, is this even about the casting anymore? Where do we draw a line in the sand and just say, yeah, okay, this isn't it? But I actually think it's really good for the organizers to be enforcing that, because it separates your tournament from everything else. If you have some really solid shoulder content, it's gonna be remembered, and people will look back and say like, oh yeah, do you remember that Blast skit? Do you remember that Flashpoint skit? Even ESL were producing some around that same time as well, which at the time, I think Flashpoint had released their first set of skits, or their first skit, and they filmed a bunch more. And then ESL came back, I think the day of or the day after, with their own skit. And while I'm sure they filmed it in advance, while I'm sure they had a bit more preparation, did feel a little bit like a punch back. Like, okay, you're trying to add some shoulder. We're doing some shoulder content too, which I think is great. The fact that they are trying to leverage caster talent like that. I think the trend will continue. I think if the MOBA genre is anything to dawn on, it's got a lot of history in its own right, but they've been doing it a lot longer, then I think it's a great direction, because especially with online CS, you need that differentiating factor.
One of the things that I think is probably the most interesting aspect as well is when you get people who are actually content creators, like Haka, for example, who've made all of these YouTube videos. When you get broadcast talent that are content creators, and then they start to make content or provide interest in content made for your broadcast, your tournament, it's blurring the lines almost. Like in the past, when we saw a tournament content, like tournament organizer content. It was usually like hyping up for the next match, or here's like a trailer for ESL1 Cologne or something like that. And maybe they used the likeness or a moment of the casting from one of the hype games or something like that as backing, but they never really leveraged it, the casters themselves or the broadcast talent themselves until it feels like very recently, right? Like obviously Scrawny and Launders over at Blast, and then you had pretty much the whole Flashpoint 2 crew. So how do you think that in general, going from independent creator to maybe even contractor or something like that, when you're coming at it from the content creation angle, what do you think the future is for this sort of tournament backed content creation? Like, do you think it's going to overtake the conventional independent creation? Are we just not there yet? Is that something that we ever will get at? Like in general, in your own words, I suppose, like what is the future for CSGO content that's centered around a broadcast?
Well, I'm worried because I think in a lot of ways, the CSGO community is we're very hard stuck in our ways. So we don't I look at Dota quite often, especially for the international and that sort of content. I know Sir Action Slacks does some shoulder content interviews, some weird and just strange and funny things at the event. And I think that type of content has a place in CS, but I don't think it's going to be well received, which is sort of the next the line that I think CSGO content needs to take, is being a little bit more open-ended, a bit more friendly. Because even if you look at competing FPS Valorant, that's going to be a lot more accessible to a younger audience. And I mean, it's got flashy colors, characters you can maybe sort of main or identify with. That's not the same. That's not in the same way there for Counter-Strike, because it is so much more hardcore and it's had a longer history. So I think the future holds a lot more beginner-friendly content, and I think more well-produced stuff. I think on YouTube in general, when I look at say a sick Astralis round or an awesome strat that they may run, the same video may be produced by 6 different people, and it all feels very similar. The structure is very similar. There's no extra mile gone for graphics or production or anything of the sort, which I think is where we will end up needing to go, because if all the content starts to feel the same, then at what point is there any evolution?
It's a concern as well, because you can't necessarily expect either. Like it's almost a catch-22, right? If these independent content creators are just trying to make, like, maybe they have the schedule where they try to do like 1 video a week or something like that. If they have to also get bogged down in maybe hiring out somebody to produce graphics for it, or to edit it in a more flashy way or something, and again, be more produced like you're saying, that feels like a much more than just a one-person job. And at that point, you kind of stop becoming that independent creator, right? So it's an exciting window into the future almost, to think of like all of the videos that you enjoy from Hawka or Mahone, or even like Launders on his channel. Imagining if those were to get even better produced, maybe like the fat gets trimmed or something like that, or they, a different angle gets taken, and they have the backing of a tournament organizer for the purpose of producing that video content. Part of me thinks that maybe it would never actually be fully replaced. The independent content has that niche where it feels more real, if you will. But it's an interesting thought exercise, I think, to imagine where tournament organizers are going to go. Have there been ideas as well, especially since they're relying on a lot of the same people for ideas that are going out and putting out these independent videos anyway? Do you think that there's a situation where maybe some stuff, like, have you had ideas, for example, where there's not going to be any way that one guy might be able to build this idea and make it happen, but a tournament organizer, or backing with funding and with the people necessary? Have there been ideas such as that you couldn't do yourself, but you'd like to see somebody try?
Well, something that I wanted to attack, and it kind of got interrupted by Flashpoint in a way, was I was going to look in depth at the 6-man roster of Vitality. What was it particularly that changed in Zywoo's game plan, or Vitality as a whole? How were they restructuring around implementing new players like Masuda or like Nivera, and how does that affect that structure? Is that then a viable option? But then you need to parse through probably 40, 50 demos to try and pull up enough data where you're satisfied with that narrative enough so that it's not just they're trying this one thing this one time and you're painting it a picture as if that is the game plan. I'm sure it's ever evolving. They've had limited practice when they'd initially brought him in. And so I wanted to do a well-produced piece of content around that. And then Flashpoint comes around. I'm like, oh, I really want to produce strong content. And I always look back at the old Yahoo esports stuff from Launders. And I think he made like a swag video that I thought was very well made. All of that, I think, was actually kind of a height of independent creation because he had, I think, multiple people working with him to try and get those produced. But it had a longer turnaround time. And I don't think you always get the right kickback for the amount of time invested, which I think is, again, like you were saying, this sort of catch-22, where as an independent creator, are you putting in all the extra time and effort into making it more well-produced, a better piece of content in the long run, just for it to get the same amount of views as your other piece of content that took 30 minutes to an hour to make? It's really just such a hard position to be in, because I think we need it for the future, and I think that content has so much more value than pumping out 50 demo reviews in 3 or 4 months. But it's just never going to receive the same kind of viewership and kickback that all of those the sort of quantity will over the quality.
Yeah, sort of anecdotally, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Video Game Donkey, but he's also recently done a similar approach where almost as a lark, like we thought it was a joke initially when he released a video saying he was done making good videos, which is sort of in reference to his I'm done making League of Legends videos. But so he does this, and then he actually does go and make these, like, clearly took him like an hour to make, like, 3-minute, 4-minute videos, but they get like quintuple the views that he normally gets and stuff. And it's like, as a joke, he's actually succeeded. So it's sort of the same thing that you're going after there. Is, for whatever reason right now, the algorithmic gods favor quantity and over quality, perhaps, or maybe not over quality, but just in general, the fact that you realistically have to sacrifice on quality in order to get the sheer number, in order to stick with the algorithm in that sense. And, the kind of content that we might be thirsting for as a general hardcore audience might not be the kind of content that is going to be long-term financially viable, right? It's a hard thing to square in that sense. So one of the things that I was curious if you had any thoughts on as well, though, since you did mention that, like, the future of broadcast backed content seems like it's well-produced versions almost of the same kind of content, or maybe slightly different, right? But a similar vein as to what we're already seeing from these independent creators, something that will make the content itself feel unique and branded in that way to further the image of the tournament organizer itself. Do you have any ideas for more independent creators, things that maybe they're just completely overlooking, that content that you would like to see, or is this something that you don't want to give away because you want to make this yourself? Like, what's the take here?
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything in particular that sort of strikes out. Just having your own graphics for a broadcast or for a demo review, as opposed to just pulling up the CSGO map that I've seen 50 million times in YouTube videos. Even using tools like Skybox or anything of the sort, which I'm sure they want more content creators to actually go to them because it's better branding for Skybox, I'm sure.
Of course, yeah.
There's another one that I'm forgetting about.
Another thing, like another
Stats
demo
Helix
reviewer?
as well.
Yeah,
like sort of those tools where you can pull up a different way to look at the minimap, I think is just slightly more engaging because you see a difference. It's not just, oh, we're in CSGO, we're looking at the CSGO screen. It's here to stay the whole entire video, which I think just gets a little bit boring at times. Outside of that, I think a lot of it is just additional fluff, having nice transitions, having a good camera and a good backdrop, having a bit of a talking head moment, then introducing some of the content as well, because then you focus on yourself as a content creator, as well as the overarching gameplay, which, again, some of the more hardcore audience may not enjoy, because I think there's a very, there's this sort of attitude where it needs to get straight to the point. I just want to know what I need to know and get out of the video. I don't want to sit here any longer than I have to. But at the same time, that level of content, if you produce it well enough, will keep them engaged, and hopefully they fall in love with you as well as the videos, which I think, if you look at Elmer Putty, I don't think he ever had to do sort of talking head moments, but he's got a very stringent fan base behind him. That's, especially with all these moves that he's making now in Tier 1 CS, people cannot be more excited for a guy who just started out on YouTube.
One of the things that I wanted to sort of segue into now is, since you were talking about one of a recurring theme in the content discussion anyway, was how do you make sure that you feel uniquely yourself without maybe distracting too much from what is in essence like the core qualitative values of the product or of the content. And with casting, it feels like that's an even tougher job than with content, because casting is a situation where not only is there something about it where you have to learn like from the bottom rung almost, and you've got to kind of figure out like what is your own system and what is your own methodology behind it, what's your conception of casting, and like the system that works best for you and the system that works best for you with duo partner X versus duo partner Y. And then there's also, of course, the human element and dealing with TOs and dealing with all the connections that you have to make along the way in the industry side, which is a completely different game. So trying to balance all of the different things that you need for casting while also feeling unique, like feeling that you can put on a uniquely good, but also uniquely yourself broadcast, that must be a very challenging thing to sort of ride the line with. So I was curious as to how you felt, you've been tackling that. And maybe earlier you said in 2020, you were focusing on being able to provide those interjections in the middle of a play-by-play without it feeling like it's detracting or distracting or anything like that. So what's the process by which you even get to that sort of thought process where you've come up with this thing where you think this is a hole in my current casting flow and this is something I want to address? How do you even get to the point where you're thinking along those lines? What is the way that you yourself have had to start to conceptualize casting to make things unique to you, but also obviously very good and very highly polished?
Yeah, I think especially with so much online work where you're off camera, you're not really shown as much, especially the lower down the food chain you get.
Yes.
You'll maybe see some highlight videos on YouTube, and it's so counterintuitive to look at it this way, but if there's a great play and you're casting all the way through it and you don't ever hear your co-commentator, I feel like that's a poorly commentated scenario. It shouldn't ever be one guy losing his mind, the other guy just sitting back like, yes, he's having a moment. He's having a great game. What a fantastic play. You should be feeding off of each other's energy in such a way that your reaction should just be raw. And I think a lot of the time, that's the reason I had to combat that myself, is because I often felt like I needed to just give them hard space. And at the start, I was so particular about, as soon as I hand it over, that's it. I don't talk. I even ran push to talk on broadcasts so often so that I didn't have background noise where I'm maybe looking up numbers or looking at an HLTV post or whatever, or HLTV stats at the same time. But it just doesn't come across as well. And I think more recently, I've actually started sort of just standing up, stepping away from the keyboard and the mouse, just so that I'm more focused on providing the most real version of ourselves on the broadcast, while still providing enough room and enough flexibility for highlight reels and stuff like that to be implemented without it feeling too raw. And you're asking primarily what spurred on that topic of conversation, and it was highlight reels and was this ability to produce higher level content where if there is like a top 10 plays at a tournament, you want, as a commentator, you really want your voice to be in that top 10 because it looks cool and it feels cool. And the best way to do that is to deliver a great hype response. And if you're set up perfectly for a moment, it should be as easy as that. You shouldn't even have to think about it.
That's another thing too, is balancing not just for the broadcast, but also for the potential highlight reels that might be coming out as well. Like this is something that I've heard from people who have also done casting work, is that they sort of conceptualize maybe like the pistol round or the one of the last gun rounds of a half or something like that as almost like this is the play-by-play's playground, and they can sort of prance around and pick something, smell the flowers. They sort of have the full domain, right? That's under their control. And it's interesting to hear a bit of a sort of another take on this, where you're not like taking control as much as you are just keeping your own space dedicated for whatever interjections might hype up the play, might increase the overall, again, prowess and quality of the broadcast, but you're also covering your base of making sure that the highlight reel is inclusive in that sense. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting point too. Like, is it possible that you're able to balance making sure that you are uniquely yourself on a broadcast, making sure that the broadcast is high quality, making sure that the broadcast has moments where everybody's reflected in the highlight reels, and all of these different things, right? There's so much that you have to do just for the show itself, and then having to try to balance all of those things. Have there been cases where you've seen, casters just they're not able to cover all that? Like, do you have any strategies yourself for covering all of those bases, or is that something that's still like an open question as to whether or not it's even possible?
Working as a duo for a long time definitely helps, because I think you get to recognize sort of common handoffs or sort of small cues where this should be a more important round. Especially, I try and set up different scenarios with different levels of grandiose, effectively, because I expect a certain outcome in a round. And that doesn't always go across, especially online, where you can't just look at each other or tap each other on the shoulder and just see each other visibly like standing up and shaking and just being excited about what's going on. So I think it's more difficult now, but I don't think there is a secret to it. It's all just comes down to feel. It goes back to what we were saying about play-by-plays and understanding the game, because that has a large amount of impact about how well you pace yourself into a big moment, which is, again, what you were saying about Sadakist. And I think as well, what makes Anders such a good commentator is that he goes from laid back, chill, we're just talking about the game, to, oh my god, what the hell is, what hell is happening, so quickly and seamlessly that nobody bats an eye. But for others, you're going to need to sort of pace yourself into it and have this sort of climactic moment where they got the ace or they pulled off the clutch, and then it can all simmer down afterwards, and you can start to reflect about how crazy that moment was.
It's an interesting point as well, the idea that you're sort of keeping track of these things, like what you mentioned about Anders, where most people are just along for the ride, and that's how you know it's successful. But when you start to like really pay attention to the particulars, a bit of a more like a puff piece question here for you, but have there been points where you've said, I can't even watch Pro Counter-Strike because I'm too busy thinking about all the different things they're doing with the casts? Has that happened? Has it almost like soured the cake for you in a way?
Well, you want to learn from who's actually on the broadcast if you're not at the event, right? Like, what does this guy have that I don't have? What could I be doing better? And I think the commentators that I looked at the most when I was, especially in my, so I've now been doing this for 2 and a bit years. After my first year, I started looking at Launders and Scrawny a lot, because they were starting to sort of be on the come up and be more regular at events, and they tried stuff out. They honestly put themselves out of their comfort zone so often and tried a whole different, a few different approaches to try and make the broadcast more engaging. Like Launders was trying, you could sort of tell he was sort of artificially inflating his own hype to try and present a more dignified and a sicker moment, effectively. But because you follow them through their years, you know that they're working to try and improve their own game, so you notice these things. But if you're a newer viewer, that may just seem like the norm. So learning from others has definitely made it a little bit more difficult to look at Pro Counter-Strike, because what I want to do is I'll see a thing on screen and not hear the commentators talk about it, and I'm like, I would have brought this up. Oh, he brought up a thing that I didn't notice. And we're trying to fill each other's holes, but then nobody's going to have enough space. Okay, bad phrasing. But nobody's going to have enough space on a broadcast to hit on all of these points at the same time. So there's always going to be small things that you can pick out and be like, oh yeah, I would have said that on the broadcast. Sure.
Of course.
I can say that from the comfort of my own home, where I'm not having to talk 40 minutes in a row. So it's a difficulty, but you definitely become a critic of others while trying to improve and be most critical of yourself in a way.
One of the things that I wanted to close on here is the idea, or just going back a little bit earlier before Flashpoint 2 to some of the Dreamhack events that you casted with Tea Time. And I wanted to ask a little bit about how that process came to be. So we talked about this a little bit before we got started over here, so I already know a bit of the particulars. But my main question at this point is that, like, if I have the chronology right, you were doing some of the open qualifiers for the event itself, because Dreamhack decided that they were going to open IP some of those. And at some point along the lines, maybe before the open qualifiers actually even became public knowledge, T-Time himself had been tapped, and he tapped you in exchange for the duo, and that's how you guys got on the broadcast itself. So was the decision to go in for some of those open qual games purely to get yourself in shape for the event, and also maybe track some of the teams that were coming up so that you would have some narratives, you'd have some stats prepared to go into the main event and talk about, here, these people fought all, this brutal open qualifier to get here, and this is how we are now. Was that the main reason, or was there some other reason why you decided to go for those open qual games?
Well, so we sort of been working together for a little bit through the Malta vibes for a while. We worked consistently together for a few months in that regard, and then, like you said, T-Time got tapped, and some of the teams that were actually in the Malta vibes were some of the teams going through the open qualifiers. So in a way, we almost felt uniquely qualified versus some of the other talent that may have been engaged in the broadcast to sort of harken back to some of the older games and seeing some development in play or something of the sort. But absolutely, it was about preparation, creating our own storylines, and understanding how those teams were going to play and what our expectations should be going in. Because I can't remember what group we were tasked with, but we had FaZe, we had Soul, we had Godsent. We got very familiar with those guys in particular, and especially Soul, where they had this really hard-hitting Portuguese fan base where they really, really, really want to do well. They had a win against Vitality 8 months ago. They're a team you can't underestimate. A lot of those points are there, but you don't see the same, especially because FaZe were in sort of a damaged state at that time. You could see a world where Soul could potentially win the game against FaZe, and that would be an upset in its own right, but I don't think it was an upset that we were prepared for that upset because we had seen some of the older FaZe games and some of the older Soul games and seen how the two might stylistically be different. So the open qualifiers and the closed qualifiers definitely helped to cement that, but we had our own little prep phase where I think T-Time even posted about it on Reddit, but we had like a little prep broadcast effectively for the teams within our group to see if we could better familiarize ourselves with stylistic choices the teams may make.
And how impactful was that kind of prep itself, right? Because this is something that I see argued is some people want to prep more for the idea of just like getting themselves in form. Essentially, they cast themselves into form, sort of like how some teams have historically. I mean, even FaZe have been sort of guilty of this, but they play themselves into form, right? In a tournament, they might drop the first game. Navi's also some team that's been like this, and then they come back and they look like their normal selves. In a way, I've seen some casters suggest that maybe you do have to sort of do a dry run, or maybe cast a game that you're not as invested in organically, just so that you can make sure that you've had your morning coffee almost, right? It's the warm up for casters. So some people will say that that's their cup of tea, so to speak. But I figure for a color, for somebody who's more of an analyst, this must be super useful for you as well, just for the sake of having more background on the teams, being able to prep those narratives the way that you said. So what was that sort of prep process like, and how did that translate over? How much of the stuff that you prepped were you able to actually use on the main event?
Well, especially because we were talking about how if you don't understand anything about the game, do you still have a place in commentary? If you come into a game where you've got this really loyal fan base coming in to watch all their games, if you're surprised by, say, Muterus in a position on Vertigo, and he's there every single round, you're like, and you actually bring that up on broadcast, like, oh, it's strange that Muterus is there every single round. But if you looked at any of their demos, you'd see that that is a thing that they do consistently. So if you're surprised, it shows that you lack the knowledge on a team, and I think that takes away from a viewer, because they're going, oh, these analysts, these commentators, they don't know what they're talking about. They haven't done their homework. So I think it adds a lot of validity to what you're saying in the commentary if you're able to harken back to previous games and actually have an understanding of how they've set up on defaults and what their choices are in general. But there is, I think, a fine line to be drawn, because I think if there is going to be an upset, being surprised at the upset is that much more rewarding in a sense, which I think is counterintuitive to what I was saying earlier. But if you have these newer teams where they are unproven and they really, really surprise you as a commentator, you can really reflect that and just be super excited for the underdog story that may or may not happen.
That's a fair point as well. Being surprised at an upset is something that, like, that's part of why even the fans themselves are happy with upsets, right? They themselves get engaged. They're rooting for the underdog, so to speak, or maybe they have
Unless they've put bets on their.
Yeah, then they're angry bettors in the DMs, right? Which is completely different. So actually, one of the things that I also wanted to talk to you about is exactly that point that you made at the beginning of the answer to that question, which was the idea that as a color or even as a play-by-play, remarking on the strangeness of a position that's not actually that strange, or maybe like overlooking some aspect of a team's game simply because you didn't do the prep. One of the things that I've seen argued is like the most important thing for especially a color commentator is to feel authoritative, like feel like you are the informed person on the broadcast. What you say is essentially gospel in a way. Like this is, you're here to explain things that have happened, predict things that likely will happen, draw some sort of comparisons. And then if something unexpected does happen, be able to and equipped to explain why it did happen. Right. And that seems to be in so many words, right? It's almost the role of the color in that sense, right? So my question to you then is like, is prep also about just knowing that you've got your bases covered in that sense, right? Did doing the prep for that DreamHack event sort of alleviate any potential stress or anxiety that might have come up just normally on a broadcast? Like the sort of counterexample here would be if there was a team that you did no prep for, or it was impossible to prep for, like the Cloud9 example, where you don't necessarily know that much about what they're going to be like. You can really only draw upon storylines. Does that make it more sort of nerve-wracking to cast one of their games when you know that nobody realistically can be an authority on a team like that?
Yeah, flying very blind for the Cloud9 game is definitely daunting because you do feel out of control. You're basically driving a car with no wheel, and you're along for the ride. Which I think you have to then be able to just be a play-by-play and talk through or even theorize with your co-commentator. I think that's what me and Anders did a fair bit of, where it was just talking about a position and how difficult it was for them to deal with, and what are some of the solutions. Are there solutions to what's happening? And so creating scenarios where you can analyze the game without hearkening on a team too much and thinking more about the overall game state or game situation is where you have to then sort of be that authority figure again. And comes from understanding the game or watching other teams play and knowing how they might approach a situation like that. And that's actually where I think I fall short, is I don't feel as though first off, my memory, not the best. So I really need to watch something over a fair few times before it is cemented in my mind that, oh, this is a strategy FaZe do, or it's a strategy that OG do. And I'm not very good at bringing those up on broadcast, but just at least remembering a player in a position and how impactful they can be in that spot can alleviate some of that stress. And 100%. Prep goes a long way in terms of making you feel more confident on the broadcast. Not only as a color commentator, but as a play-by-play as well. You know what to expect from certain players, and you can create that narrative that this guy has done this time and time again for this team.
One of the things that you mentioned a little bit earlier as well is when you're not prepared and you deliver some comment that isn't necessarily the most accurate about a player or about a team, it delegitimizes you. It makes you a little bit less verifiable in a way as a veritable source in the eyes of the viewer who is informed. My question then is, do you think that TOs, for example, or talent managers particularly care or pay enough attention to even pick up on things like that? Because the other game that I mentioned for commentators is negotiating for gigs in the first place with a lot of these TOs. And my concern would be that if you're ever in a position where you're sort of doing a lot of prep work and making sure that you're providing the best broadcast that you can, which is essentially the only thing you can control as a broadcaster, is, how well do I show up to work that day? Would there be at that point an opportunity for commentators to just overlook an entire other layer of the game, so to speak? Like, is that a situation where you yourself have maybe observed the TOs maybe not necessarily even keeping track of whether or not you've done your job to the point? Like, I guess another way of looking at it is, have there been cases where you've casted a game and then at the end you felt absolutely dreadful? You think everything went wrong. I really should have just fixed this. But then, somebody comes in with the talent manager, like, all right, good job on the day, see you tomorrow, or something, like nothing ever happened. Has that something like that happened before behind the scenes?
I don't think anybody goes within commentary and has moments where they're just if you go through commentary and you consistently think you're doing a bang up job every single time, I'm sorry to tell you, but you're deluded. There's always something to work on. There's always something that could go wrong, and you may just not be feeling it on the day. And I know that I've had that where my handoffs has been bad, or I linger on a point for a bit too long, and I maybe miss a bit of action, and things like that, where it just cascades kind of out of control. And at that point, you just need to take a step back, breathe, allow your co-commentator a bit more space. And if they take over the broadcast, if it is more of a 70-30, they'll feel it, you'll feel it, but that's part of why there's a double dynamic. That's why you have two of you showing up, so that if there are any faults, you can fill in where you need to. So I've 100% had days like that. I'd like to say they're far and few between, but at the same time, you can't expect everybody to be showing up at their A game consistently every single day. And that's where I think I felt the most sympathy for the ESL guys, especially last year, where it seemed like it was just back-to-back events because they were effectively living in the studios. I think in Germany, I don't remember where they were in particular. Yeah. But then you don't get that prep work. Even if you wanted to do it as those commentators, which I'm sure they will have done some level of prep, if you are not only finding out about which teams are in those tournaments 1 or 2 days before the event actually kicks off, you don't give commentators enough time to actually formatively prep for those teams. So you have to fly in blind. And I think that's maybe why, in general, it's maybe not seen as a huge piece of importance, and maybe why talent managers or TOs may not pay as much attention to whether those details are brought up on the broadcast, because they are working on more stringent deadlines. And I think a lot of that comes down to just tournament structure, when the invites are announced, how soon talent can actually get their hands on any of that information before an event, because the timing window just doesn't line up with the preparation I think that needs to go into it.
Comparing that to your time with Flashpoint, is there a situation where maybe they have like some sort of, I'm just speculating here because it's essentially a tournament organizer with a lot of the forward faces of that are broadcast talent themselves, right? And I was wondering if there was a position where maybe there was like a workshop after an event or during some downtime where you guys all came together and were like, let's do some reviews or something like that. Like that wouldn't seem out of place to me if something like that had happened. So was there a more like attentive push from the people at Flashpoint to maybe look at and provide some feedback for people who wanted to opt into that for when they were on the broadcast? Was that something that had ever come up, or was it more like other events that you've been a part of where there wasn't necessarily that much attention paid?
I think it was primarily focused, especially for the sort of the newer talent. So I know that when I was doing some of the Telestray segments, I would have gotten sort of small critiques from the producer or from the likes of Thor, and just sort of giving me a push in the right direction, where I have a tendency to speed up a lot, and if I stutter, I'll just stumble, fall, get on my knees, continue crawling, and then eventually stand back up again. And just slowing down significantly makes it a lot more presentable without it seeming unnatural. So that's one of the bits of advice he gave me. But I know for me, Alan in particular, there was a lot of direction and a lot of maybe not workshopping, but just tips and in general ideas that they could we could bear in mind when we were on broadcast, which is helpful. But in terms of overarching, let's sit down and all talk about how we did today, it didn't really happen too often, because not only are people professional enough where they understand their own criticisms, because you're going to be your own worst critic, but also there are long days for a lot of people, and so just retiring back to the room, bang out another day because they want to do their own prep for the day ahead, that's going to be a priority. And especially over a month period, nobody wanted to, I mean, maybe not nobody wanted to, but just the timings that didn't really make sense to have something like that, I don't think.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I was even impressed that people like, for example, Maui Snake was able to do some talk shows, and Hawka was able to put together some videos still. Like, the fact that people were able to do this ancillary content in the middle of the very long Flashpoint 2 circuit itself is impressive in that sense. So Yeah, we've essentially come to the closing point of the interview at this point. And one of the things that I wanted to leave you with was obviously the floor to put any plugs out or to say anything, any final words. But of course, since we've covered so many different topics, if there's anything that you wanted to sort of to mosey on about as a closing topic, that's also fine. And yeah, the floor is yours at this point. Thanks for joining me.
Oh no, I appreciate being on. I think we've talked through quite a lot of what I'm focused on recently, because I know I'm trying to produce or create my own production setup at home, which is a task in and of itself. So upgrading a camera, that's going to be fantastic. I think in general, we're just going to need to set our rooms up like production studios as quick as possible. So that's a priority right now. I hope that doesn't become a staple for the years to come, because I know for a fact that TOs are saving a lot of money probably by not having these stadiums, or maybe losing a lot because of so many cancellations. But at the very least, people are still able to continue on living. I appreciate the content that you've been putting out as well. I've been watching some of the interviews here and there, not to sort of blow any whistles or anything. But yeah, I don't think I have anything in particular to plug. You can follow me on Twitter at YouM3. It's YouM3 TV. I've got a number in my name because I'm stupid.
Hey, I've got a number too. We're epic.
I know.
We're cool kids.
I find it is the worst thing for me because I get called YouM3, YouM3. I've had someone call me Yum once, and I'm just like, where did the O go?
They were flirting.
It's confusing for people. Yeah, it's definitely a difficult one for branding. But yeah, that's it for me. Thank you for having me on.